Melbourne has secrets hidden in plain sight. A ballroom above Flinders Street Station that was sealed for 35 years. A bowling alley buried beneath the city's most famous laneway. A convict-built prison where Ned Kelly walked to the gallows. And beneath it all, tunnels, burial grounds, and the ruins of an asylum system that locked people away for being inconvenient. In this video, we are counting down 15 abandoned places in Melbourne you have never seen before. Stay with me to the end, because number 1 is a place that 100,000 commuters pass through every day without knowing what sits above their heads. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's begin. Number 15. The Bradmill Cotton Factory, Yarraville. In the industrial suburbs west of the city, on the banks of Stony Creek in Yarraville, a massive factory complex sits crumbling behind security fences. The Bradmill cotton mills operated from 1926 to 2007, producing cotton thread, fabric, and textiles for the Australian market for over 8 decades. At its peak, the factory employed hundreds of workers and occupied an enormous site. Multiple buildings, warehouses, chimneys, and loading bays spreading across several hectares. When the factory closed, the buildings were left largely intact. Equipment sits where it was last used. Office furniture remains in some rooms. The sheer scale of the site is what strikes you first. This was not a small workshop. It was a full industrial campus, and the fact that it has sat empty for nearly 2 decades in one of Melbourne's most rapidly gentrifying suburbs says something about the complexity of redeveloping contaminated industrial land. Bradmill is heritage listed and earmarked for residential development, but as of now, the factory stands as one of the largest intact abandoned industrial sites in Melbourne, a monument to an era when things were still made in the inner west. Number 14. The Box Hill Brickworks. About 15 kilometres east of the CBD, tucked behind suburban streets in Box Hill, the ruins of a brickworks that first opened in 1884 sit quietly in a pocket of bushland that most locals drive past without noticing. The Box Hill Brickworks operated for over a century, producing the bricks that built the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. The kilns, chimneys, and drying sheds processed local clay into the building material that defined the suburban expansion of the early and mid-20th century. When the works closed, the site was partially rehabilitated, but the core industrial structures, the kiln foundations, the chimney bases, the old quarry pit, now filled with water, remain among the trees. Walking tracks wind through the site, and interpretive signage explains what once stood here. But the ruins themselves are the real story. They sit in suburban Box Hill, surrounded by houses worth millions, a quiet reminder that this neighbourhood was built, literally, from the clay beneath its own streets. Number 13. The Victoria Harbour Shipping Control Tower. On the waterfront at Docklands, a slender concrete tower rises from the wharf, an oddly utilitarian structure amid the glass apartments and waterfront restaurants that now define the precinct. The Shipping Control Tower was built in 1966 to manage vessel traffic in and out of Victoria Harbour, which was then a working commercial port. For decades, controllers in the tower directed cargo ships, tankers, and bulk carriers through the narrow harbour channels. When the port operations shifted to the west, to Swanson Dock and Appleton Dock, the tower lost its purpose. It was decommissioned and has sat empty since, its windows dark, its stairs unused, its control room silent. The view from the top, by all accounts, is magnificent. A 360-degree panorama of the city skyline, the Bolt Bridge, and the harbour. But no one sees it. The tower stands locked and inaccessible, a piece of working port infrastructure stranded in a precinct of luxury apartments, looking out over water that no longer carries the ships it was built to guide. Number 12. The abandoned bowling alley beneath De Grave Street. Underneath Melbourne's famous De Grave Street Cafe precinct, one of the most photographed laneways in Australia, lies a space that almost no one knows about. Beneath the cobblestones and coffee shops, an abandoned bowling alley and tavern have been boarded up and forgotten for decades. The bowling alley was part of the Decay Street underpass, also known as Campbell Arcade, a pedestrian subway connecting Flinders Street Station to Decay Street that opened in the 1950s. The arcade was built ahead of the 1956 Melbourne Olympics to manage pedestrian traffic around the station precinct. For years, the underpass was a functioning commercial space with shops, a bar, and the bowling alley. But as foot traffic patterns changed and the precinct declined, the commercial spaces closed one by one. The bowling alley was sealed. The tavern was boarded up. The arcade itself survived for years as a graffiti-covered laneway of small shops and music stores. But with the construction of the metro tunnel, much of the original infrastructure has been disrupted. The bowling alley, its lanes, its seating, its fittings, reportedly sat behind its sealed walls, largely untouched for decades, preserved in the cool underground air like a time capsule from the 1950s. Whether it survives the metro tunnel construction is uncertain, but the idea of it, a bowling alley sealed beneath one of Melbourne's most famous streets, inches from the feet of thousands of tourists who have no idea it is there, is one of the most remarkable hidden spaces in the city. Number 11. The Pentridge Prison Walls, Coburg. In the northern suburb of Coburg, about 8 kilometres from the CBD, a set of massive bluestone walls encloses what was once Victoria's most feared prison. Pentridge Prison, originally the Coburg Stockade, operated from 1851 to 1997 and held some of the most dangerous criminals in the state's history. It was the site of Victoria's last execution. Ronald Ryan hanged in D Division on the 3rd of February 1967, the last person executed in Australia. The prison's bluestone walls are up to a metre thick in places. The guard towers still stand. D Division, the maximum security wing, held prisoners in cells so small that a man could touch both walls with his arms outstretched. The exercise yard is a small square of concrete enclosed by walls so high that the sky is the only view. Since closure, the site has been progressively redeveloped into a residential and commercial precinct. Apartments now sit inside the prison walls. A hotel occupies one of the former cell blocks. But the heritage-listed sections, the gatehouse, the walls, D Division, and the exercise yards, remain intact. If you walk through the precinct today, you pass through archways that once processed prisoners, along corridors that once echoed with the sound of iron doors, and past walls that held a man in the hours before he was hanged. The apartments are modern and well appointed. The history behind their walls is not. Number 10. The Kew Asylum, Kew. About 6 kilometres east of the CBD, on a hilltop in one of Melbourne's most affluent suburbs, stands one of the most architecturally significant abandoned buildings in Victoria. The Kew Asylum, officially the Willsmere Hospital, opened in 1871 as one of 3 major psychiatric institutions commissioned by the colonial government, alongside Arradale at Ararat and Beechworth in the northeast. The building was designed in the Italianate style, with ornate facades, arched windows, and a central clock tower that dominated the Kew skyline. At its peak, the asylum housed over 1,000 patients. The complex covered a vast campus with wards, gardens, workshops, and outbuildings. Treatment methods followed the same arc as every Victorian asylum. Moral treatment giving way to overcrowding, restraint, electroshock therapy, and institutionalization that lasted lifetimes. The asylum closed in 1988. For years, the building sat empty, an enormous, decaying complex in one of the most expensive suburbs in Melbourne. Parts have since been redeveloped into luxury apartments, but the main Italianate building was left largely untouched for decades, its windows dark, its corridors silent, its clock tower watching over a suburb that had grown up around it and moved on. The contrast between the elegance of the architecture and the suffering that occurred inside is the same trick used at Arradale and Beechworth. Beautiful buildings designed to hide ugly truths. And hey, before we move on to our next entry, I hope you are enjoying this video so far. If you are, it would mean a lot to us if you hit that like button and shared this with a friend. Now, let's continue. Number 9. The Royal Park Asylum Ruins. About 3 kilometres north of the CBD, in the parkland surrounding Royal Melbourne Hospital, fragments of one of Melbourne's earliest psychiatric institutions survive among the trees. The Royal Park Receiving House, later known by various names as it expanded, served as an intake facility for patients being assessed before transfer to the larger asylums at Kew, Arradale, and Beechworth. For decades, patients arrived here first. They were examined, classified, and assigned a destination. Many never returned from wherever they were sent. The facility operated from the late 1800s through the 20th century, expanding and contracting as mental health policies shifted. When it was finally closed, most of the buildings were demolished, but fragments remain, foundations visible in the grass, heritage-listed structures incorporated into the surrounding hospital precinct, and the knowledge that this patch of parkland was the first stop for thousands of people who were about to disappear into Victoria's asylum system. If you walk through Royal Park today, past joggers and picnickers, you are walking through a landscape that was once the gateway to institutionalization. The park is beautiful. The buildings that stood here were not. Number 8. The Melbourne General Cemetery Vaults. In the inner suburb of Carlton, about 2 kilometres north of the CBD, Melbourne's largest and oldest cemetery holds over 300,000 burials spread across 43 hectares. The Melbourne General Cemetery opened in 1853 and has been in continuous use since. It is the final resting place of prime ministers, criminals, war heroes, and the unnamed dead of a growing colonial city. But the most mysterious feature of the cemetery is its vault system. Beneath the surface, stone-lined underground vaults extend in rows beneath the older sections of the cemetery. Many were built in the 1800s for wealthy families who purchased private vaults for their dead. Some have been sealed for over a century. Others have cracked open over time, their contents visible through gaps in the stonework. The vault corridors are not open to the general public, though guided tours occasionally access some sections. The atmosphere is exactly what you would expect: cool, dark, and still. The air smells of stone and age. The walls are lined with iron doors, many of them rusted shut. The Melbourne General Cemetery is not abandoned, but the vaults beneath it, sealed chambers holding the dead of a colonial city, undisturbed for over 150 years, are among the most hidden spaces in Melbourne. Number 7. Yarra Bend Asylum Site, Fairfield. Along a bend in the Yarra River, in the bushland between Fairfield and Alphington, the site of Melbourne's first psychiatric institution occupies a stretch of riverside parkland. The Yarra Bend Lunatic Asylum opened in 1848, making it one of the earliest purpose-built psychiatric facilities in Victoria. The original buildings were constructed on a prominent bend in the river, surrounded by bush and deliberately isolated from the city. At its peak, Yarra Bend held over 500 patients. Conditions were notorious: overcrowding, inadequate staffing, and treatments that ranged from ineffective to brutal. By 1925, the asylum had been closed and its patients transferred to newer facilities. The buildings were gradually demolished through the 20th century. Today, the site is parkland, part of the Yarra Bend Park system that lines the river through the northeastern suburbs. Almost nothing of the original asylum remains above ground, but the site itself is still there. The bend in the river, the flat ground where the wards once stood, the trees that have grown where patients once walked in supervised lines. If you know the history, walking through Yarra Bend Park at dusk takes on a different quality. The river moves quietly past the site. The bush is thick, and the knowledge that 500 people were once confined here, in the bush beside a river they could see but never reach, does not leave you easily. Number 6. Fort Nepean, Mornington Peninsula. At the very tip of the Mornington Peninsula, where Port Phillip Bay meets Bass Strait through a narrow entrance known as the Rip, a network of military fortifications sits hidden in the coastal scrub. Fort Nepean was built in the 1880s as part of the defences designed to protect Melbourne from naval attack. The fort was expanded during both World Wars and was the site of the first Allied shot fired in both conflicts, a distinction that most Australians are unaware of. On August 5, 1914, the fort fired a warning shot across the bow of the SS Pfalz, a German merchant vessel attempting to escape Port Phillip Bay on the day Britain declared war on Germany. It was the first shot of World War I fired by any of the Allied nations. On the 4th of September 1939, the fort again fired on a vessel, this time stopping an outbound cargo ship for inspection at the start of World War II. After the wars, the fort was progressively decommissioned. The gun emplacements remain. The underground tunnels and magazines are intact. The observation posts still face the sea. Today, Fort Nepean is open to the public as part of Point Nepean National Park, but most visitors head for the beaches and the walking trails. The fort itself sits at the end of a long walk or shuttle bus ride, and many people turn back before reaching it. Those who make it find themselves standing in a network of concrete bunkers and gun pits overlooking one of the most treacherous stretches of water in Australia, a fortress that fired the first shots of 2 world wars and that most Melburnians have never visited. Number 5. The Quarantine Station, Point Nepean. Just down the coast from Fort Nepean, on the same headland, stands one of Australia's most significant and most neglected quarantine stations. The Point Nepean Quarantine Station operated from 1852 to 1980, intercepting ships suspected of carrying disease before they could enter Port Phillip Bay and reach Melbourne. For 128 years, passengers were diverted here, disinfected, examined, and held in isolation until health authorities declared them safe. Immigrants from across the world passed through this headland. European settlers, gold rush prospectors, post-war migrants from southern Europe and the Middle East. Those who arrived sick were treated in hospital wards on the headland. Those who died were buried in small cemeteries that dot the scrub. The station's buildings, shower blocks, hospital wards, staff quarters, disinfection chambers, spread across a large site, connected by pathways through the coastal bush. Since closure, many of the buildings have deteriorated. Some have been stabilized. Others remain in states of advanced decay. Roofs collapsed, walls crumbling, interiors exposed to the salt wind. The quarantine station at Point Nepean is less well known than Sydney's North Head, but its role was identical: to filter the sick from the healthy before they could enter the city. The people who were held here could see the distant skyline of Melbourne across the bay. Some of them never reached it. Number 4. The Abbotsford Convent Ruins. In the inner suburb of Abbotsford, on the banks of the Yarra River, a sprawling heritage precinct of sandstone and brick buildings occupies one of the most significant sites in inner Melbourne. The Abbotsford Convent was established in 1863 by the Sisters of the Good Shepherd as a Magdalene asylum, an institution that confined women deemed to be fallen or morally wayward. The women held here were not criminals. Many had been placed by their families. Others were sent by the courts for offences as minor as vagrancy or being in the company of men. They were put to work in the convent's laundry, the Magdalene Laundry, washing clothes for hospitals, hotels, and businesses across Melbourne. The work was unpaid. The conditions were austere. The women were not free to leave. Today, the convent has been repurposed as an arts and community precinct. Galleries, studios, cafes, and event spaces fill the old buildings. It is one of the most popular cultural venues in Melbourne. But behind the artisan bakeries and weekend markets, the bones of the institution remain. The chapel still stands. The dormitories are intact. The laundry, where women worked without pay for years, is now an event space. The Abbotsford Convent is not abandoned, but the institution it was built to house, the forced confinement of women for the crime of being poor, unmarried, or inconvenient, is one of Melbourne's darkest open secrets, and it hides in plain sight behind a very good brunch menu. Number 3. The Old Melbourne Jail. In the heart of the CBD, on Russell Street, stands one of the most intact and most disturbing prison buildings in Australia. The Old Melbourne Jail was built in stages from the 1840s and operated as a prison until 1929. During its 80-year history, 135 people were executed within its walls, hanged in the central courtyard or in the purpose-built execution room that sits at the end of the main cell block. The most famous was Ned Kelly, the bushranger, who was hanged on November 11th, 1880. His last words, according to popular tradition, were, "Such is life." He was 25 years old. The jail's cell blocks are preserved almost exactly as they were during its years of operation. The cells are small, dark, and cold, barely wide enough for a man to stretch his arms. The walls are bluestone, the same dense volcanic rock that built much of colonial Melbourne, quarried by convicts from the same geological formations that underlie the western suburbs. The narrow corridors are claustrophobic. The hanging beam in the execution room is still in place, bolted to the ceiling, with the trapdoor beneath it still functional. Death masks, plaster casts taken from the faces of executed prisoners immediately after death, line the walls of the jail. These are not reproductions. They are the actual casts, made by pressing wet plaster onto the faces of men and women who had been hanging from a rope minutes earlier. The details are extraordinary. Eyelashes, pores, the compression marks left by the noose. Ned Kelly's death mask is the most famous. His face is calm. His eyes are closed. The rope mark around his neck is clearly visible. He had a full beard. He looked older than 25. After the jail closed, it was used as a police museum and a storage facility before being opened to the public as a heritage museum. Ghost tours operate at night. School groups visit during the day. But the essential reality of the Old Melbourne Jail is not theatrical. It is architectural. The building was designed to contain people in the smallest possible space, to restrict their movement, their light, and their contact with other human beings. And it did so for 80 years, executing 135 of them along the way. Number 2. The Flinders Street Station abandoned upper floors. Melbourne's most iconic building, the grand ochre and cream facade of Flinders Street Station, is also one of its most mysterious. The main building, completed in 1910, is enormous. It contains over 100 rooms spread across multiple floors above the station concourse. Most Melburnians know only the ground floor, the clocks, the ticket gates, the steps where everyone arranges to meet. But above them, an entire world of abandoned rooms has sat empty for decades. The upper floors once housed a library, a gymnasium, a creche for the children of railway workers, and meeting rooms used by dozens of clubs and societies. The Victorian Railways Institute, which managed the upper floors, ran educational classes, dances, film screenings, and community events. The ballroom, an expansive, ornate room with high ceilings, decorative moulding, and a sprung timber floor, hosted weekly dances that drew hundreds. By the 1980s, the upper floors had fallen into disuse. The clubs closed, the library was emptied, the ballroom was locked. For 35 years, the rooms sat sealed above the busiest train station in Australia. Their contents untouched, their ceilings peeling, their windows dark. When photographers and journalists occasionally gained access, they found rooms frozen in time, furniture still in place, chalkboards still covered in writing, a gymnasium with equipment that had not been moved since the day the door was locked. In recent years, the Victorian government has committed to restoring the upper floors as part of a broader redevelopment of the station precinct. Some rooms have been reopened for events. The ballroom has hosted exhibitions. And now, we have reached number 1. And if you have stayed with me this far, I promise you, this is the place that will change the way you look at Melbourne's most famous building. Number 1. The ballroom above the clocks. The Flinders Street Station ballroom is not just a room. It is a symbol of everything this video is about. The layers of Melbourne that exist above, below, and behind the city that most people see. For decades, the ballroom sat directly above the main entrance of the station, above the clocks, above the steps, above the place where Melburnians have arranged to meet each other for over a century. Every day, tens of thousands of people passed beneath it. None of them looked up. The ballroom was built for joy. It was a place where railway workers and their families came to dance, to socialise, to mark occasions. The sprung timber floor, the ornate ceiling, the stage at the far end, all of it was designed for a community that gathered in this room every week, in the heart of the city, in a building that belonged to the railways and to the people who ran them. When the dances stopped and the doors were locked, the room did not disappear. It sat there, sealed, gathering dust for 35 years. The ceiling peeled. The paint faded. The floor, still sprung, still functional, waited for dancers who never came. Pigeons entered through broken windows and left their marks across the timber. But the structure held. The proportions remained. The light still fell through the tall windows the same way it had in the 1950s, the 1930s, the 1910s. If you could have stood in the ballroom during those 35 years of silence, and for most of that time, you could not, you would have been standing in one of the most beautiful forgotten rooms in Australia, directly above the heads of 100,000 commuters who had no idea you were there. The ballroom is now being restored. But for the better part of 4 decades, it was Melbourne's greatest hidden space. A room built for music and movement, sealed above a station built for trains, in a city that walked beneath it every single day without ever looking up. That is what Melbourne is. A city of layers. A city where the most extraordinary things are not always at street level. Sometimes they are above you. Sometimes they are below you. And sometimes they are right there, behind a locked door, above a familiar clock, waiting to be found. I hope you have enjoyed this video, so make sure to share it with your friends and see you in the next video.